It's Thursday, March 7th. I'm Adam Walsh. This is The Signal. And you've probably heard that term, just transition, the concept of greening the economy in a way that is fair and doesn't leave anyone behind. Today on the show, we are talking about what that transition could look like here in this province and what leadership is needed to get it done. And we are live streaming today's show, audio-wise and video-wise. So if you are, scrolling through on your desktop or on your phone, cbc.ca/NL, or on the app, you can watch us live. If you're, listening, thinking, gosh, I'd really like to see these people today. Well, congratulations, you can finally do it yet again today. And we'll pop the show up on YouTube later. So if you're listening and thinking, gosh, I'd really like to watch that later, you can. We are everywhere for you. I look at today's show as a follow-up of sorts, or just a follow-up to the show we did on February 22nd. So that one was called Politics of Newfoundland and Labrador Climate Change Policy. On that show, we had Lloyd Parrott, PC energy critic, Bernard Davis, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Jim Dinn, leader of the NDP. And a big part of that conversation was looking at current policy, what's coming next, what all that means, and we talked about plans for a just transition through that show. So today, building on or looking at those conversations, because we will have clips from that show in today's show as well, I've got a new group in studio, and we will continue the discussion, right? How we adapt our economy here, how we green the economy, how we bring everyone forward together. This is stuff that affects each and every one of us. Joining me in studio, Sophie Shoemaker, co-president of Fridays for Future St. John's and Munn political science student. How you doing?
I'm great. Thank you.
Thanks for coming in. And welcome back, Alita Zedel, also co-president of Fridays for Future. How are you?
Hi there. It's always a pleasure to be here. I'm doing well.
All right. So, Sophie, you're a political science student. Alita, what are you studying again? Remind me.
Sociology.
Sociology. All right. So we got poli sci, we got sociology. Excellent. And then we've got, I think it's a professor of yours who's sitting in here too, right?
Yeah.
Angela Carter, welcome back to the show. So Politics Profit Munn, Angela is on the Net Zero Advisory Council, and Professor Carter is researching equitable transitions from oil. How are you?
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
And Jessica McCormick, President, Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor. Hi.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, great group here for this today. Just transition, equitable. It's the same thing, is it not, Professor Carter?
Absolutely the same thing. And the reason why some of us have stopped using just transition is because it was politicized.
Yeah.
In Alberta, in particular, by Premier Smith. But the thing is, it doesn't matter what we call it. Sustainable transition, just transition,
green transition, you name it, whatever, right?
Right. The point is that we know the economy, our energy economies are changing, and we've got to prepare for a future that's different, and we have to do it in a way that protects the workers who are most exposed and the communities who are most exposed. So it's about changing our energy systems, but not doing it the way that we've often done development in the past, doing it in a way that takes care of people, prioritizes social justice and equity.
I want to talk to the activist crowd, and there's two of you here. What are your thoughts when it comes to the activism you're doing? And we'll talk about the climate strike shortly. But what are your thoughts on that term, just transition, and what needs to be done in Newfoundland and Labrador and beyond?
Well, just transition is obviously it's inevitable because it has to happen. There's no other option, really, and especially for future generations. Like, we're both very young, and it's very scary for the youth of today, all the things that are happening in our world. And just transition is important because it secures our future, and it makes it so that we can have kids, or I don't want to spend my life studying for a future that isn't secured.
Yeah.
Alita?
Yeah, I echo what Sophie's saying, and I also think within the idea of just transition, it's important to recognize it's not new. These ideas are not new. The idea of just transition has been around since the 80s, and it's almost a little disheartening that we're still fighting for it.
When's the next climate strike?
That is on April 19th, and I think it's going to start at 11 a.m. At the Clock Tower. So that's going to be a global strike date as well.
And how are you both feeling just about the traction that the global climate strikes that Fridays for Future has been getting from the start to past the pandemic into where we are now?
It's really, really good, and it is definitely helping to raise awareness, and I think helping a lot of young people to find their voices within the climate movement. It certainly did with me. Like, I started going to climate strikes when we had our first climate strike in Newfoundland and Labrador in 2018, I believe, and I wasn't involved in the movement at all at that point in time. But now it's really grown into something that I can be proud of and a lot of people can be proud of, and also I think has a real shot of making change in our world that is necessary.
Yeah, it really is a body of activist work, right? Like when you look at starting from that point and continuing on with this and being younger as you started, and now even though still relatively young, you're becoming veterans of this movement, right? Like how does that feel?
It's really exciting. It's really neat to be at the forefront of such like a powerful and important movement. And like I really hope that the energy just grows and snowballs.
Jessica McCormick, labor side of this, for yourself, when you in your position, thinking about a just transition, how does that kind of hit you and your thoughts as a labor leader?
Yeah, so I was one of the listeners kind of grumbling, maybe nodding along a bit, but grumbling a little bit to the last conversation around just transition on the Signal. And I think what maybe frustrated me a little bit is when our political leaders talk about how, just transition the term has been weaponized, or we shouldn't be using it. We should use another term to talk about a sustainable future. And for me, whatever title we give this transition, the term just transition is about centering workers and ensuring that workers have decent jobs, adequate income, and the training they need to work in a decarbonized economy. And so when we get into a debate about terminology, I think that kind of is an easy excuse to water down the role that workers have to play in making decisions about what the future looks like. So for me and my members, we want to be around the table and be central to those discussions.
And what are you hearing from folks, from the rank and file members who are working jobs, looking at, because for a lot of the discussion, right, there's been some unknowns for years. Like even though the term's we've been talking about this, it's been around since the 80s. We're looking at the question of what does come next. Yeah. What are the jobs? And we're slowly, or quickly actually, seeing what some of them can be. But what are you hearing from members about how they feel?
What I hear from workers, both people that work in the oil and gas industry, people who work in other sectors of our economy, people whose family members rely on those jobs, there are a lot of questions and a lot of unknowns. And I think it speaks to a lack of a coordinated strategy from our provincial government to outline what the labor market will look like in a greener economy and what the skills and training needs are. I think sometimes people have a lot of fear about whether or not they'll have a job in the years to come. So we try to talk to our members about prioritizing making existing jobs sustainable jobs and then creating new ones, and ensuring that they have access to pension bridging if they're near retirement, or access to funding for training, but that those jobs will exist. And I think that, I guess the key point, there's this excellent quote by a union activist in the 80s working in this kind of industry, who said the real choice is not jobs or environment, it is both or neither. And I think that's how we want to frame the discussion around a just transition, to give our members a sense of security that they will have a job and that it'll be a good long-term sustainable job.
I want to play a clip. I've got 3 clips to play today. And the first one is from Bernard Davis, Minister of Environment and Climate Change. And this is some of that discussion on February 22nd around just transition.
So this is where I believe that creating opportunity, employment, skilled labor, that's why looking at the investments that are being made, not by the provincial government, by external countries and or industry, to things like hydrogen. That's where we need to be looking at, and oil and gas for that matter as well. I mean,
will we see in the next round of planning for climate policy for this province? So will we see language around a just transition then?
You'll see language about it creating employment, absolutely, and you'll see language around the when we talked about this last year about a just transition. Yeah. We've been working very hard on creating opportunity for people to transition, whether that be operating training opportunities for them, investing in training for people to transition out of the oil and gas sector when that time comes. We're in a period of transition, as we keep talking about, and I hate to use that word all the time, but we're an oil-producing province in an oil-producing federation. And, we have to transition from that at some point. That transition.
So are you recognizing, as they said at the UN at the end of COP, the UN saying it signals the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era? Is this something you're recognizing?
We've always recognized that fossil fuel is going to end at some point. Mm-hmm. And, there's a need out there now for it. And my thought and our party's thought and our government's focus has always been to invest in that, making sure the people that are in the oil and gas sector have the opportunity to transition when time comes for that to happen. There's a product that we have in off our shores that is required around the world. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing that as the most efficient way possible.
The February 22nd running of the Signal, Bernard Davis, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, there speaking with, me. Standout bits there, right? I keep hearing things like when that time comes, at some point, when it comes for the time. Do we have any thoughts from what the minister was saying? I know you do.
I think that it's just, the time is now that we're actually, falling behind in preparing for that transition. And what I heard from the minister, what stood out the most for me, Adam, is talking about who is making investments in those new industries. And I think kind of shirking responsibility for the provincial government, actually, to be, intervening in creating industrial policies that where the province has a role to play in funding those projects, has a seat at the table, an equity stake, and has a say in some of that direction. The federal government has introduced fairly strong policy around a Sustainable Jobs Secretariat, Sustainable Jobs Partnership Council, specific legislation that guides how policy will be made. We don't have that same thing at the provincial level, and we need those structures in place. It's a very haphazard approach, I think, that is pushing things off into the future that need to be addressed right now.
Professor Carter.
So absolutely to second what Jessica's saying, because every single case that we see around the world of successful transition that worked for communities and workers, that's exactly what's required. It's labor and firms and government sitting down at a table regularly to plot how we're going to manage this transition. That's the only way this gets done, period. That's what the research shows. That's what all the cases show. And now we've got, dozens upon dozens of cases globally. So, yeah, absolutely seconding what Jessica's saying there. Also, though, I was really struck by that comment. I listened to that interview actually a couple of times to try to figure out what it is that Minister Davis is trying to convey in that point, and this notion that at some point, we are definitely at that point now. And something that occurred to me, so I moved home over the summer, right? I came back home from Ontario, and as I was packing up all of my stuff that I toted around, from job after job, I found my Blockbuster Video membership card. And that got me to thinking, I wonder if the government of Newfoundland and Labrador isn't now behaving as if they're the executives of Blockbuster Video in 1995. Seeing that, thinking that they've got some kind of, great market position, they're dominating the entertainment sector. And there's this little upstart by the name of Netflix that was coming at that point in time, right? By 2010, Blockbuster is bankrupt. Today, Netflix has got a market value of over $100 billion. So just the same, we are at a point of energy transition. We have got 6 years of pretty status quo oil demand. After that, all evidence is indicating that global oil demand is declining, and any oil exporter is going to be affected by that. And so if we're not preparing for some kind of phase out, we are going to be heading towards a crash out. We've already seen what that looks like in this province. And, in some ways, if we look carefully at what firms are doing in the offshore, we are getting some signals through the noise. And what we're seeing is exploration rates have fallen off. The provincial government through the board, the Canada, Newfoundland, Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board, they're saying that we've got parcels available for potential bidding. Firms are not stepping forward, right? So basically what we're seeing in Newfoundland and Labrador right now by firm activity is a withdrawal from the sector. And of course, the Equinor decision in June to say, okay, Beta Nord, this big field, huge reserves, actually we're going to wait on it, not for climate reasons, but for economic reasons. Too much volatility in markets. They don't think they're going to get the money back from what they're putting into it. Okay, so now regardless of what governments might choose to do, firms are acting. So how are we going to protect our economy from those changes that are currently afoot right now? Minister Davis is telling us that we're going to wait. We're going to, at some point, deal with it. too late. That's walking us off the plank.
Alita?
Okay. There's a lot to unpack with that, but like, what really rings true is like, yeah, it's too late. Like, we need to be doing this now. We needed to be doing this years ago, and like, there's some really great graphs. I was gonna pull them up, but I can't find them about how what we have to do to combat climate change is becoming harder and harder, and we have to take more drastic measures now than we would have had to back in the day. And like, yes, technology is getting better and that helps, but we really do need to act. We can't be relying on oil. And like, there's a lack of action with that from our government. If you look at the last budget, I was also going to try and pull numbers up for this, but in the last budget, we spent more on exploration for oil and funding oil companies than we did on climate initiatives. You have to look between the lines there. You have to add two numbers up for oil and gas. But the fact that we're spending more on oil and gas than we are to take care of our planet and ensure our future is scary. Yeah, and to kind of tie into what Jess is saying with labor, we also need to fund programs to train employees. We need to fund education, and like, we're seeing lack of funding in in Memorial University and in CNA, and like, I think I said this on a previous interview with you. It's really hard to find work terms in renewables. Like, they're just not there. And what co-op offices put out is oil and gas. All of that gets a lot of funding, and we're not giving the same funding to renewables.
Sophie, any thoughts from yourself on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what everyone said. Just, along with Alita's point, I think something that we have to remember is that having a just transition, or whatever type of transition you'd like to call it, it has to be doing more than saying we want a just transition. Unfortunately, we can't continue to keep funding oil and gas and explore for oil and gas if we want to transition away from fossil fuels. These are things that don't work together, and yeah, it's not feasible for a transition.
What happens for student leaders like yourselves, right? So activists, Fridays for Future. What happens when you speak to politicians about this? What's the reaction? What do they tell you?
It's frustrating, I would say. Yeah. I've definitely had some interaction with politicians, and I can say that the reaction I usually get is, you don't understand what's really happening, or some thinly veiled comment about how I'm not being realistic. And I would argue that the reality of it is that there is no other option if we want things to be okay. If we want the economy to be okay, if we want the planet to be okay, there's no option to not transition away from fossil fuels. And as much as I understand that seems like a big ask, it's vital.
Yeah. And so this is what they say you're not being realistic about, because you're saying transition now, is it? Or
now. Yeah. Yes. And I think we understand that, Rome wasn't built in a day, but also that like the action now is necessary. We can't start acting in 5 years. We can't start acting in 10 years. The reality is that we should have been acting 20 years ago. The evidence was there 20 years ago. Scientists were telling politicians 20 years ago that we should be starting our transition away from fossil fuels. And that did not happen. So
yeah, I like to add in there, like, as much as they're telling us this is unrealistic, they also look to us for answers. And it's almost a little disheartening being a youth and still kind of educating myself on these topics. It's a constant process. But leaders are looking to us to tell them what to do. And it kind of stinks because, like, go do your own research. You have the resources. You can reach out to the scientists and understand what can we do. But they're just not doing it.
I want to play one more, the second of 3 clips here. We've got one Lloyd Parrott, PC Energy critic. The first voice you'll hear is me, and then it will be Mr. Parrott there talking about depending on oil. But the biggest effect we could have for the carbon being put into the atmosphere would be not drilling for oil, right? I mean,
no, I disagree. So
that's the biggest impact.
If
would be
everyone
no oil
did the
coming
same
from
thing,
there.
if we could eliminate it. But it's not just about vehicles. We depend on oil for everything. The headphones you're wearing right now, the glasses you have on, the clothes we wear, the food we eat on a daily basis. EVs are going to require it. How do we mine for the rare earth minerals? How do we do all of these things? I think the spec is right now they're saying somewhere in the vicinity of 24 million barrels a day in 2050 they still think we're going to need. Mm-hmm. So when you think of what we produce here as a province, why can't we be a leader in that? Why can't we still be producing if we have functional offshore vessels that can do it right now? That's my point.
Yeah.
My point isn't, listen, Advance 2030 was a plan that the Liberal government came out with, and they said there were 600 finds out there of fields as big as Hebron or Hibernia. The reality of it is we know it's there. How do we get to hydrogen? There has to be a transition. Why not utilize LNG, which is a much cleaner option than the oil? There's got to be a way to go from step A to step B, because if we eliminate everything instantaneously, there are going to be repercussions from in our healthcare. Everything that depends on oil and gas is still going to depend on it.
Lloyd Parrott, PC Energy critic, speaking with me on the Signal's February 22nd show, The Politics of Climate Policy in Newfoundland and Labrador. This is The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. If you're watching us on live stream, cbc.ca/NL, thanks for watching, and obviously, thank you for listening. Full house here today in studio for this conversation about a just transition and what it can look like and what the leadership needs to be to get that to happen in this province. We've got Sophie Shoemaker, co-president of Fridays for Future, Alita Zadell, also co-president, the other co-president of Fridays for Future. Jessica McCormick is here, president, Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor, and Angela Carter, politics prof at Memorial University, who is researching equitable transitions from oil. Thoughts on that clip there from Mr. Parrott?
There's so much there to unpack.
There's a lot, yeah.
We could do a line-by-line refutation, actually. Okay. I think that would be that's another show, though. Yeah. But I think what I would say is we need to be careful about this because it happens all the time in debates about oil in Newfoundland and Labrador. No one is saying that the taps need to be shut off. No. But the reality is, and this is something that the federal government has shown us, that at about 2030 on down to 2050, there's going to be a sharp decline, not a turning off the taps, a decline sharp to almost zero, basically, in our offshore by 2050. Now, those are graphs and projections that included the Bay du Nord project going ahead. Okay, so if you have a look at the Canada Energy Regulator, files, you'll see very clearly what the most conservative estimate is, and that by conservative I mean the best case in terms of production estimate is for our offshore. So declining production steeply starting just about right now. So the issue is, if we are banking on that sector as our socioeconomic security, if that is slowly and then maybe really steeply being eroded right out from under us, how are we going to plan so that we don't have the bottom fall out of the economy? Right? And this is all about planning. And absolutely, Alita and Sophie are correct. This is something that we need to be planning. In Germany, for its coal transition, it was a 30-year transition. This is not something that happens overnight, so we need to get it done today. As for, will Newfoundland and Labrador be producing the last barrel of oil? This is such a common argument. Every oil-producing jurisdiction in the world says that its oil is clean and green and ethical and that it's going to be the last barrel standing. All jurisdictions are saying that. Some jurisdictions are not going to be producing those last barrels of oil. The ones that will are the cheap and easy ones. Newfoundland and Labrador's oil is not cheap and easy. I mean, look at that. The Flemish Pass is 500 kilometers offshore, and it's 1.2 kilometers down to get to the oil. This is ultra deep, ultra far offshore, and ultra high cost. Newfoundland and Labrador, as oil markets tighten up, so as demand decreases, our oil is going to be priced out of the market. That's the reality. And we know that because firms are already showing it to us. If we look at what firms are doing in the offshore, they're pulling back capital investment. They're not investing their own money in expanding production. They're going to play out the fields that are currently in development, but not new production, right? So, yeah, I mean, we need to start taking seriously the information that's available to us and start planning. So again, yeah.
So yeah, like the comment there about plastics, right? And well, like your headphones and this and that. So, but what you're saying is the industry will answer things for itself for wherever the cheaper oil is, and that's the oil that will be used to make plastics. And because of the cost associated with drilling in deep into the offshore, companies will decide on their own to be like, hey, we're not exploring anymore. We'll be taking it out of the ground here, where you can just put a straw down and
exactly.
Drink the milkshake.
Yep. So cheap and easy, that's where it comes. We're not cheap and easy. So, and this argument about plastics, I mean, our oil, the oil off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador, it goes to the United States and it's used mostly to fuel up the gas tanks of Americans. Okay, so, but the United States is now hell-bent on decreasing its demand for oil on just a cost basis. It is cheaper now to fuel up with renewable energies than it is fossil fuels. It's a market case that we're talking about here now. And so the reason why this matters, so, okay, when you look at the International Energy Agency and they say over 2022 to 2023, there was a 50% growth in renewable energy capacity. This is the 22nd year in a row that we've had record-breaking renewable capacity. All right, so we have this uptick of renewable energy capacity like we've never seen in history. So why do we talk about that in the context of Newfoundland and Labrador's oil sector? Well, the reason is because 44% of global oil demand is going towards transportation. Yeah. And if suddenly you've got this massive uptick in the electrification of transportation, you're cutting into demand, right? So all of this really matters for our economy. And, again, this is the signal and the noise. This is where we need to be planning with labor today for the transition that's inevitable, that's already happening.
Yeah, I mean, we are not going to control the changes in global economic markets, but we can control how we respond to them here. And what I heard Mr. Parrott say was, why not us? Why can't we be, the ones to take that last barrel of oil and sell it? And I guess my question is, why can't we be true leaders in a renewable economy and really investing in building that economy and creating good unionized jobs for workers in that sector, rather than continuing to focus on something that the firms themselves are telling us they're moving away from. But in order to do that and in order to get there, we need a clear, coordinated approach from the provincial government that lays out, to speak to what Alita and Sophie have brought up, exactly what the training needs are, exactly what the existing skills base is and knowledge base is here in this province amongst workers, and what the future training needs are, and how many of those jobs will exist, and what the decent wages will be for them. We don't have a coordinated plan for that right now, and that's a place that we need to start. But this idea that we are going to somehow control those global economic, or have a say in what those global economic markets look like, I think is not the way that we should be moving. And instead, let's think about I think radically transforming our provincial economy to one that is focused on sustainable, renewable jobs.
So then what more would you like to see if we're talking about radically transforming, right? So we're talking industrial policy, that type of thing. Yeah. What are some specifics you would like to see from the provincial government? Yeah.
I mean, I think we have a tendency towards thinking that, bigger mega projects are the silver bullet to the economic challenges our province faces. And certainly hydrogen is a renewable industry that we, are investing a lot in, and in hopes that that's going to build a more sustainable economy in Newfoundland and Labrador. But there are smaller scale, more long-term options when you think about energy retrofits commercially and residentially, when you think about zero emissions infrastructure. Angela was just speaking about electric vehicles, but also, public transit. I heard on the last episode maybe some dismissive comments around investing in public transit. But, I, as you know, Adam, worked with the FFAW and spent a lot of time traveling all around the province to rural communities. Not everybody has access to a reliable vehicle, and public transit isn't something that we need to just focus on in St. John's. There are those types of options. The electrification of our ferry service would have a significant impact. And then we're already seeing movement by firms like mining companies in Labrador who are moving towards electrification of their operations to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, because they want to be competitive competitive in global markets. And there is a huge demand for green steel that is securing long-term, unionized, well-paying jobs for people in Labrador. So there are all of these options that we can be investing in, that we are investing in. And so to have, like, I'm talking about real, policy at the provincial government level, not just leaving that to the federal government, that lays, a pathway for what the next 30 years will look like for workers and, for everybody in the province.
And if I could add, so what Jessica's laying out here is precisely what has worked in some of the best cases that we have. And so recently I was speaking with the person who led the oil and gas transition in Denmark, right? So the person who was at the lead of the oil and gas sector portfolio for the Danish government as they were deciding what the future of their sector was going to be. And so I said to him, how is it that you did this? Like, how did you plan it? And he said, well, we knew, and here we've got the same comment that Minister Davis said, right? There's a parallel comment here, but a different outcome. They both said, we know at some point that we're not going to be producing oil anymore, okay? And Minister Davis is saying, okay, we're going to wait and see, and we'll at some point deal with that. But what the Danish government did is they said, okay, we know we're going to have a bunch of unemployed oil and gas workers. So what we're going to do is we're going to figure out exactly who they are where they are in their life cycle, their career cycle. Are they younger workers? Are they nearing retirement? And we are going to figure out what those different groups of workers are going to need. We're going to stop subsidizing the oil and gas sector, and we're going to start reinvesting in a diversified economy. In their case, it was offshore wind because they had the experience in that. And so this was all about working with the labor community to do the labor market analysis, create the training that Alita has motioned towards, the training that's going to be needed, re-education programs as well for workers, bridging to retirements, and so forth, so that could be softened. They also, and this is important for our province, put an end date on fossil fuel production. And by doing so, the oil sector knew that, okay, so we've got some time, we've got a couple of decades and we can keep producing oil, but we know it's coming to an end and we can start then making our investment decisions on that basis. So it creates a stable policy environment instead of waiting for a crash out. So yeah, this is the kind of upfront proactive policy that's done across parties with labor at the forefront. We know what it is, Adam. This is
why
exactly
isn't it being done, do you think? Like, because you folks have, all of you here, you've had access to talking to folks in government. What are your thoughts on why it is not happening? Like, is it a scared about politics thing? Is it just a not understanding thing? Is it just having a different point of view? Like, what do you think it is?
I think part of it is they want that cash grab from oil. They want that quick money. It does pay. It is something that can bolster our economy a little bit. And making that switch is definitely it's not easy and it's a little scary. And I'm sure Angela could talk a little bit more about that. But that's what I think.
Yeah, you think folks are looking at the the dollars and cents and being like, look, this is here now. It is. We're still pumping it out, and we can profit off it, and then the future's the future. Okay, that's a point.
Yeah, I mean, I think way too often in both Canadian history, but in Newfoundland and Labrador history, we've let corporations exploit our resources without guaranteeing, lasting value for workers and for government. And so I think that we are really letting the corporate side of the puzzle here drive the agenda when we need intervention from government and from workers, which is what we're talking about when you mentioned industrial policy, Adam. And I think there's just we're seeing the federal government do exactly, what workers are asking them to do by putting together strong, sustainable jobs legislation. So it really is, very confusing to me to not see the same type of approach from the provincial government because, it's not like we aren't banging down the door asking them to give us a seat at the table. We absolutely are. But I, from my perspective, I see that part of the problem is being, allowing corporations and firms to kind of drive the direction of our economy rather than letting workers and the community play a role.
Thoughts?
Oh, there's so much here.
Yeah.
I mean, the cultural side, oil, we discover oil and it comes online just as the fishery had collapsed. So it takes on this cultural meaning, an outsized cultural meaning. And as I've said before, in Denmark, oil workers don't consider themselves oil workers. They consider themselves energy workers. They just want to work in the sector that is growing. But here we've got this fixation, maybe some kind of fetish, where we're fixated on oil.
People wear stickers or buttons that say "I love oil and gas," but as opposed to like you're saying, hey, these folks are energy workers.
Exactly. So I love oil and gas workers.
Yeah.
I love that we can take revenue from any sector, ideally one that's people generated, people focused, that we can put towards public investments. Like that's really, do we really care about if it's oil or anything else? No. But to the point, and Alita's right, what have we gotten from the oil sector in terms of funds? Yes, $20 billion in revenue since 1997. That's about the cumulative total. That sounds like a lot of cash for a small population. But if you look at the total value of all the oil that's been extracted, we have gotten such a small slice of the pizza. And in fact, Newfoundland and Labrador has some of the lowest marginal tax rates and take from the industry. I mean, it's really actually been quite shameful. Someone else has walked away with a lion's share of the value of that oil. And so now we're seeing revenues to the province sinking from the oil and gas sector. And we're suddenly, wondering if our economy is going to be in disarray or not. What I would suggest is that if we look to other countries, other jurisdictions like Norway, for example, what they did with their oil money is they realized, this is a one-time asset. If we pull this out of the ground and we sell it, if we're not investing it elsewhere to diversify the economy, it's just like you're selling the family silver. It's a one-time asset and it's gone. So their money from the oil sector didn't come into general revenues. It wasn't treated like that and then just spent as if it would always be there. What we should have done from the get-go, and we still could do now, is any money that's coming from the oil sector gets put aside and it's used and invested carefully in a nonpartisan way on the transition and on diversification. That's the sensible and safe thing to do with that money. So now we make about 13.5%. That was our last fiscal year. 13.5% of Newfoundland and Labrador's revenue comes from the oil sector. That's from oil royalties. It's becoming a very small piece of our pie. And arguably, with the data that I see, it's going to be ever declining from here on in. So now we need to figure out a way of not having that money anymore in general revenues. I mean, frankly, so that's the challenge. That's the fiscal challenge now before us, I think.
Sophie?
I would say, too, I agree with what everyone has said, but I would say, too, that, the government, as Angela touched on, knows that oil and gas is a cultural thing in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that there are whole communities that rally around oil and gas. And they also know that making a transition away from oil and gas would be unpopular in these communities, and it's bad for votes, and it's really unfortunate because there is a lot of misinformation out there about the oil and gas sector, and specifically that it is just like this never-ending well of money that we can continue to invest in and it will always be there. But oil at the end of the day is a fixed resource. It's not going to be there forever, and we have other technologies like renewable energy that is going to be more beneficial in the future, and that we're going to invest more in. But a lot of people don't understand that it's oil and gas companies are very powerful and have very good marketing, and so I think part of not wanting to transition away is about public relations, and that the public will see it as unpopular.
Yeah, the public. I mean, that's really interesting. The public relations bit. When we look at whether it's we started the show talking about just transition and then saying, well, now sometimes it can be called equitable transition because some folks don't like that term because of politics, right? Or it can be called a green transition. So then, and then we talk about oil and gas. I love oil and gas buttons. And then Professor Carter, you said, well, I love oil and gas workers. Are oil and gas workers, do they have do you think the message is there about what everyone here is trying to do and where things are going, and that you want them to be included?
Yeah. I mean, maybe we need bumper stickers that say, I love good jobs with decent wages and benefits and job security. We might have to workshop the title a bit. But that is essentially what we're looking for, right? Like, people want economic security. And whether it is a job in oil and gas or whether it's a job in, the renewable sectors, it has to be a good job, and allows people to raise a family if they want to contribute to the community all around the province. Like that's what we're advocating for. So maybe we need a new line of bumper stickers, but there's been so much fear, I think, instilled in people, and part of it is our history, and what many people experienced with the decline of the cod fishery. So it is, I guess, a bit of a PR exercise, but it's also the responsibility of government to give people the information on what the economy will look like and to set that course. And they're not doing that right now. They're allowing that kind of fear to percolate in the community.
Well, and with that fear, is there also some stigma of like, oh, well, we're the bad guys because we're doing this, as opposed to being like, well, like Professor Carter, again, what you said, Angela, like, you're energy workers.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've my colleagues in Alberta are about to embark on a tour around the province to talk about their plan to diversify the economy in Alberta, to develop good, sustainable jobs for workers there. And it is being received very well by oil and gas workers in Alberta. We can do the same thing here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And when you guarantee people a secure future, that's all they're looking for.
And also, I think we need to take a look at the facts and the evidence of what firms do to workers, in this cycle of upturns and downturns. Now, and we're downturn all, until the end. There's no more boom and bust. We know that from here on in, it's bust. And we saw this right during COVID, right? When the firms were demanding from the provincial government and the federal government subsidies and regulatory relaxation, give us a break. We're really in duress right now. And so, yes, the provincial government extended all of these, financial advantages to the oil sector to kickstart it again. And it was at that same period that workers in the oil and gas sector were just being shed by these firms. And we see this all the time. I mean, from 2014 to 2019, right before COVID, Jim Stanford, an economist who's been working on this for a long time, has got some excellent data that shows us that just as oil production was increasing and firms were going to the bank with profits, tens of thousands of Canadian workers were being shed as cost-saving measures. If firms can automate as opposed to pay a worker a decent salary, that will always be the choice. So our firms in our offshore, are they there to create good jobs for people in our community? That is not their line of business. They're there to profit short-term from extracting oil. So we've got to, as folks working in the community and governments, we've got to demand that if we're giving any subsidies to the oil and gas sector, that they're tagged with job guarantees and good job guarantees, for example. That should be a bare minimum. But that's not what happened, right? And so I think if once workers see that, and they do now, I think especially in Alberta, right, where there's been some terrible job cuts over the last couple of decades, I think now that reality is really clear, which is why they're happy to be on board, and explore options. But here we're not quite there yet, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like with the questions of like who benefits and like that's coming up. And I think with that question, it's really important to think about who does it affect? Because there's a lot with climate change, and the climate emergency, there's like, it doesn't affect everyone equally. And like, we know that like it is, first of all, caused by people who have the most money. It's not the everyday worker who's causing it, but it also affects the people with money less than it does the people without. And so, like, yes, it can provide jobs for the middle class and the upper class, but we don't see that, like, there's not the true positive effect that we want oil and gas to have in this province that there's kind of this stigma about.
Yeah, and I think just to build on what Alita is saying and Angela's point around strings attached to some of the government incentives to industry, at bare minimum, absolutely guaranteeing good jobs, but also reaching emissions targets. I think one of the things that we also advocate for at the Federation of Labor is strong project labor agreements that guarantee that those jobs will be unionized jobs, community benefits agreements, so that we know communities will ultimately certainly benefit from any development in their area, but also ensuring that these firms are undertaking hiring practices that ensure women and Indigenous people and racialized people have a fair opportunity to access those jobs. So we can't just, sit back and let corporations and firms set the direction. Government and unions and community should be kind of involved in that decision-making process. In the U.S. in the Inflation Reduction Act, there's some good measures there to introduce incentives to develop renewables in fossil fuel dependent communities. Those types of strings ensure that people can benefit from the transition. So those are the types of policies that we're advocating for here.
I've got one other clip to play, and this one is, again, from the February 22nd show. And, folks, if you missed that one, it was a discussion on the politics of policy, right? Climate change policy for Newfoundland and Labrador. Here is in the February 22nd. So we podcasted it, and it is also available on YouTube for CBC-NL's YouTube page under the signal for the playlist. Here's NDP leader Jim Din on oil in the ground.
If it comes down to their saying, well, that's got to stay in the ground, then what is the compensation? What is that worth to Newfoundland? And what compensation must they give to Newfoundland then to basically move us towards that greener, to a transition to a more sustainable, just green economy? You can't talk about it without talking about the resource. But in many ways, I think you look at it, there's a bargaining chip here. You want us to go this route? There's a value to it. Here's what we need in compensation because we want to protect our workers. We want to protect our communities. We want to make sure that we capitalize on.
Jim Din there, the NDP leader, talking about capitalizing on, putting a cork in and leaving stuff in the ground. Is this a thing that we think can happen?
So Ecuador tried to do this, and it didn't quite work because it's it requires an incredible amount of financing to pay countries' jurisdictions to leave resources in the ground. So I'm not sure that's something that I would follow too far down the path on. However, where I think we can focus our attention, and really ought to, is the federal government, through its Sustainable Jobs Act, has been talking about a futures fund. I bet, Jessica, you've been following this. So this is, apparently multi-billion dollars that are going to be that's going to be earmarked for the petro provinces, so Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador, to help with the transition. All right, so this is interesting. The federal government is going to be offering, apparently, financial support to a province like ours to be able to transition safely. Okay, now that sounds good. The issue is, though, how is it that we're going to make use of that money should it become available? Because during the COVID pandemic, a similar kind of package was offered by the federal government for oil and gas workers. It was supposed to be a transition package. And when that money landed in Newfoundland and Labrador, it was given to firms. And it didn't actually make it to workers. Many of those workers actually lost their jobs in the subsequent months. But it was just handed to the firms to sort of, to kickstart, or in terms of royalty rebates and things like that, right? So we never really made good on a federal transfer that was supposed to be intended for transition. Okay, so let's now not repeat that mistake should this fund become available. I don't think we're going to get, anyone paying for us to keep our oil in the ground, but I do think that there might be transition funds available. Now we need to figure out through labor and firms and the government working together how it is we're going to make best use of that.
Yeah, and so establish a sustainable jobs secretariat here, or commission, or whatever you want to call it, but something that has the teeth to set the agenda and make some decisions about how, potentially those funds are spent, whether it's invested in apprenticeships and training, whether we're, collecting more labor market data. We do a pretty poor job of collecting labor market data here in Newfoundland and Labrador. So are we partnering with Statistics Canada to ensure that we have a good picture of what the economy looks like? But we do need those, we call them tripartite structures, labor and workers, employers and industry and government, all around the table, with the legislation that's needed to allow them to make decisions about how that money is spent. Because if we don't have those types of structures, we're going to see, I think, very similarly to what happened during the pandemic, that money is going to go, maybe where we don't want it to be invested. So we need those structures in place to ensure that workers have a say.
There will be elections coming, right? There will be, at some point. There could be sooner rather than later. It could be later. There'll be a provincial election, and also, who knows? Question mark. At some point, we will have a federal election. Could be sooner. Could be a little later, but not too far into the future. So for Fridays for Future, and for university students, when you're looking at having to go vote, having to do your activism, what are you thinking about these elections that will be coming at some point?
Why don't you go?
Okay, I want to backtrack to the other point
sure.
and just add in one really small thing. I think within these projects, we need to be really, really careful of what we're investing in and making sure that it's actually clean and actually green and doesn't cause more harm, because extraction and energy is extractive, that it doesn't cause more harm.
Sophie, on the elections, or if you want to build on Alita's thought there.
If I can build on Alita's thought,
Sure.
Yeah, and with the extraction, also making sure that Indigenous people are consulted, because it is their land and they were here first, and a lot of even the renewable energy projects, they're better, but a lot of oil and gas projects and renewable energy projects have not gotten Indigenous consent beforehand, and extraction is ultimately inherently colonial.
Yes.
So it's very important that we're cognizant of Indigenous people. Yeah.
And thoughts on the coming elections?
I think that, especially with a protest coming up, that I hope we get good attendance. We need to vote. Young people need to vote, and we need politicians to want our vote. That's how we have power, is that we get politicians acting for us.
Go for it.
The upcoming elections, I think, are going to be very climate change based.
Yes.
And it's weirdly become very polarized, this issue. Even though climate change shouldn't be a polarizing issue, we should all want a better future and, better jobs for everybody. Unfortunately, it has become very left versus right. And so I guess, as Alita said, students, young people interested in the climate movement, everybody needs to be exercising their right to vote. Even if you don't see anyone that you find particularly appealing, it's really important to just make sure that, democracy is safe, and, in terms of climate change in the upcoming years, that we are safe.
We got about, 30 seconds left each for
it, Jess.
both of you.
Okay, I mean, my key point, when I listened to that episode with the politicians, Adam, I've heard a lot of what we can't do. So my, request of candidates in these upcoming elections is to tell us what we can do, give us a grand vision for what a sustainable economy in Newfoundland and Labrador can look like, and that will win you votes, and speak to, the challenges that workers are facing in this economy, and give us some commitments around good jobs, good unionized jobs in the future. The Federation of Labour will be holding those parties accountable to their platforms.
Angela Carter, final word. I did my math wrong. We got like a good 45 seconds left for you.
You're giving me 45 seconds.
but just 45, 44, 43.
I'm only teasing. What I would like to see is all political parties at least imagine the possibility that we're not going to have an expanding oil sector in this province. I get it that we're banking on the lotto ticket, right? The lotto ticket of expanding oil and gas production. But what if we don't win the lotto? So let's just do some good old-fashioned economic diversification planning. Let's do it together, prepare for the future that actually seems most likely for us.
Yeah. Just add something really quick. I've been going through some old Fridays for Future stuff. I think it was 2019 strike. There is a very large crowd, and everyone is chanting, "We need you to vote. We need you to vote." And we do. We need you to vote.
All right, folks. That's it for today. Thanks for this.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right, Sophie Shoemaker, Lita Ziddell, Jessica McCormick, Angela Carter, thank you so much. That is it for today's show. Tomorrow, International Women's Day Part 2, our second show for International Women's Day this week. Tomorrow it's Everyday Hero, celebrating what we love about the women in our lives. Who would you like to celebrate? And this is not necessarily because of achievement, but rather, it can be that, but also who they are and just how they make you feel. Get in touch tomorrow. Emails, thesignal@cbc.ca. You can call the Signal line anytime and leave us a message, 709-576-5260. And if you're watching on the live stream, thanks. Thanks for checking us out. And we'll be on YouTube later today. Cheers.